This is ContactTalkRadio.com. Consciousness in action. And you are taking action into your consciousness by tuning into Contact Talk Radio.
And on TuneIn.com, Ping.fm, and UpSnap Mobile.
Contact Talk Radio.
Welcome to Medicine and Health with Dr. Paul Anderson. This is a show about opening up the often mysterious world of how doctors think. The goal? To empower the listener to gain access to the best health care possible.
That's me. I'm Dr. Paul, coming to you live on Facebook, actually, and through the CTR Radio Network. And if you're doing this later, it's probably on a podcast or a replay. So today, we want to talk about the ongoing actions of the Food and Drug Administration with respect to compounded medications. And so I'll explain what all that means and what it is and why we're talking about it today. But it directly affects a lot of people. May not directly affect you if you're listening, but it directly affects a lot of people in their ability to have access to particular types of medications. And just by way of a little bit of background, this process has been going on since 2013, I believe, or 2014. And I've been involved in it since 2014. And it's a rather long, circuitous process to try and upgrade the approval and regulations around certain types of medications, both natural and synthetic medications. And so I'll give you a bit of background, but I think the big picture here that I really wanted to talk about, having been involved in this for, 4 years, going on probably 5, is in the past, and actually currently, because none of these rules are enacted, there has been the ability of the world of pharmacy to take known compounds that are from a FDA-registered source, and as a bulk product, the pharmacist can take and, let's say, put 2 or 3 things together into a pill. So that's one form of compounding. Compounding pharmacy, actually all pharmaceuticals used to be compounded locally, so that back in the old days, the pharmacist would have all these bottles and jars of bulk substances, and then the doctor would write a prescription for in a pill or in a liquid or in a topical cream, and then later on maybe as a sterile item that they might do as like a nasal rinse or an injection or something. So it used to be completely in the purview of the pharmacy to do most of the manufacture of medications. Well, obviously that's not the most efficacious way to make, things that we use a lot of. And so pharmaceutical manufacturing companies came into the world. And some of the older ones like Bayer have been around for a long time, Merck, and some of the ones that you probably know or you see advertisements on TV or in the paper about. And they started to then take things that were used a lot and just standardize them into a particular medication. So, for example, a real common drug back in the older days for heart problems was digitalis. So they would take the foxglove plant and they would get the digitalis out of it and as digoxin eventually, and they would put it into a pill form and then mass produce it because people were using it all over the country. So why not make it mass produced? But even up through the 1970s, I recall, there were many things that were very unique. And say in pediatrics where the doses were different than for adults, or maybe it was a particular formulation that the doctor had used for decades with their patients, whether adults or children, and it just wasn't going to sell enough so that they would make large quantities of it. So there were a lot of things like that that were used in specialties like pediatrics or dermatology or something, where the pharmacist would write in what we now consider a compounded prescription or an old-fashioned prescription, where they had the regular prescription pad and they wrote a recipe. The pharmacist would then take that and go into their bulk agents, and they would put it together into a syrup or a cream or whatever it was. And then they would give that to you with a label, but it was your own medicine. And so that's really what compounding was. Well, then a lot of that kind of fell out of favor in the 70s and 80s because there was very little of that going on. But there was still the ability of the local pharmacy to make whatever they needed based on the doctor prescribing. And so there was always a place for compounding. Then long about through the 70s and 80s, certain things started to become more popular. So a lot of the things like we've talked about, such as nutrient therapies that are combinations, maybe nutrient injectable therapies. Some of you heard of like intravenous use of glutathione, for example, the antioxidant, or injections of certain types of vitamin B12 that aren't commercially available, like methyl B12, for example. So all of that sort of thing started to get more popular. And as it did, then the pharmacies that wanted to went back into the business of compounding. And that means they had all of the equipment, and they went through the right procedures and all that, and they made these different products. So another area that you may be familiar with, which are often compounded, are things called bioidentical hormones. So that's another area of compounding where maybe we'll take a common but simple example where maybe in the past, a woman might be prescribed Premarin, which is a standard trade drug of mixed estrogens, and maybe that wasn't setting well with her system. And a doctor might have compounded something like estradiol, which is just one estrogen instead of a whole bunch of estrogens. And they may give it by pill, or they may give it by a cream, or they may do something else with it. But that's an example of compounding for the benefit of a patient who might be sensitive, let's say. So there's a lot of ways that compounding has really increased in the last few decades. So it's sort of like everything old is new again, almost. So that's really what the world of compounding is now. In modern times, compounding is divided up between what is called sterile compounding and non-sterile. So some pharmacies that compound actually focus just on non-sterile things. So that would be pills, topical creams, other things of that nature that don't need to be sterile. If you're making eye drops, if you're making a nose spray or nebulizer product or something like that, if you're making an injectable, all of those things need to be sterile. And so then what arose were the rules for non-sterile and sterile compounding. They're under two different sections of the federal rule book. So then you saw the pharmacies kind of grow. Some did both. Some just did non-sterile, and some focused on sterile compounding. So that was all fine. And then a number of years ago, there was, which you may have heard about in the news, there was an outbreak of some infections that were very bad due to injectable product that was used in pain management and orthopedic medicine. So these were not natural products. These were actually standard drugs that were just happened to be compounded for the use in these procedures. Well, some of the procedures that were using these were things like spinal injection and things of that nature that maybe an anesthesiologist would do, or a pain management doctor. And there was one particular pharmacy that really stood out, and they made errors and endangered a lot of people's lives. And in fact, some people actually died because of infections from this tainted product. So obviously that's not very good. And that gets the attention of a lot of people. And so what happened then was so this is obviously prior to 2013, the Food and Drug Administration, which is responsible for the safety and welfare of the American public when it comes to foods and drugs and other cosmetics, actually, set about to investigate all of these goings on. And actually, in that case, with that one pharmacy, some people went to jail. I mean, it was a lot of bad consequences, and rightly so, because they were. It was not that they were compounding; it was that they were compounding and they were taking shortcuts, and there was a lot of things just going wrong. So then, what happened was that led to a process by which the Food and Drug Administration said, well, it looks to us like, and so this is now going far afield from the original problem. Original problem was, are you doing compounding correctly and following the rules? These people were not. So that was really the original problem. So one arm of the process started to be inspecting pharmacies, which is a wonderful thing. And a lot of pharmacies actually went out of business because they could not have proper procedures and sterility and all that stuff, which is great. I mean, it would, maybe not great if you own the pharmacy, but as far as a safety thing, that was very righteous. That was a great thing to have happen. The problem that ensued then is that suddenly the compounding pharmacies had to undergo a lot of steps up in their policies, procedures, and rules they needed to meet. And again, that's part of progress. We've had to do that in our clinic as physicians and all that. So it's not like it was, say, in the 80s or 90s. So the next round of things with compounding that happened were if you were doing sterile compounding, say for an injection or respiratory drugs and things of that nature, you had to meet even higher standards, which again is very reasonable given just modern advances and all of the things that happen. And so over the past about 6 years, a lot of pharmacies that used to do sterile compounding don't do it anymore because it was, for some pharmacies, it was $500,000, $1 or $2 million investment to get things upgraded. And not every business has that kind of capital. So the first wave of things that we started to notice was, well, there's less and less and less compounding pharmacies that do sterile product, actually less compounding pharmacies that do everything, So whether it was a non-sterile thing like a pill, but we needed to have two drugs put together that aren't normally put together, or you're trying to taper somebody off a drug, but you want to go in little baby steps, compounding pharmacy could make a liquid version of the drug. So you could literally dose it, down very, very slow. And the manufactured product from the standard, big pharmacies, the manufacturing pharmacies, just you couldn't do that. So there became a lot of background things that became a problem in that we started to have a lot of availability issues in the world of compounding. Well, parallel to this, again, roughly 2013, 2014, then the next step that the FDA took, which is far beyond this safety issue of are we making good sterile product or not, and initiated was a process called the Bulk Drug Substances for Pharmacy Compounding under Section 503A of the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act. So this is known as the 503A process, if you don't want to say all those other words. Now, just really quickly, the difference between 503A and 503B in the compounding world, so I'm not talking about 503B, that's a different kind of compounder. We're talking about the standard patient-specific compounding world where your doctor literally says, I want the pharmacy to make you something specific. And that is a large portion of compounding. Well, so a process was started, but we'll just call it the 503A process. And the process started out under the reasonable guise of, look, we had a lot of trouble, especially with this pharmacy, and we've cleaned that up through investigation and inspections and all this. But as the Food and Drug Administration are looking into all of this, we see that there's a lot of medications that may be considered orphan drugs. They're really being used for things other than what they were intended for, which is very common. A lot of regular drugs are used for things that they're not intended for every day in medicine, so that's not unusual. But the other thing was there were a lot of older drugs, and there were a lot of maybe older or long-time use, but in very small amount drugs that had never really been approved. So, and that was not uncommon, especially for older drugs. So there was a time at which the drug approval process was different. And if the drug didn't have a particular piece of paper certifying it, it could have other types of paper, these monographs, they call them. So if you had a monograph that was approved as a substitute for what they call the USPNF monographs, great. You can make that drug all you want. Well, in this new process, which is going to create part 2 of our story, what they did was they said, well, there's a ton of things being compounded. And again, remember, compounding is older than the regular drug industry. So sure, there's a lot of things being compounded. And we as the FDA feel that we are, and I'm obviously paraphrasing, but if you look this up, and in the show notes when we put this out as a podcast, I'll give you links. But if you look up in the FDA's testimony and the FDA's background documents, you can basically read the same thing. But we as the FDA, we don't, we're not familiar with a lot of these things, or they're old drugs that we weren't aware are being used still. And we want them to go through a sort of a reapproval process. So hence was born the FDA's 503A bulk substances process. So the next step was they went to the stakeholders, different physician groups and pharmacy groups, and said, what we would like you to do is to nominate substances. So later on, when I tell a story about me testifying at the FDA, I am testifying as a nominator, and it doesn't mean I may be nominated personally, but it means that our group nominated, and I'm testifying as a scientific expert or something. So substances were nominated. The idea being originally that then each substance would have a hearing, and that hearing would be what decided whether we put it on the approved list when this is all said and done, or on the unapproved list. So in the beginning, it seemed like, okay, well, hey, times change, and there's a lot of reasons to, upgrade things, and there's no problem with, looking into things that we've been using for a long time. So this really shouldn't be a big problem. And so what happened was, through a consortium of many different physicians group, which include some of the specialty societies for physicians, such as the gastroenterology societies and the rheumatology, et cetera, they might have had a drug they've been using 70 years, and it was predated approval through this process, or the previous process even, and they wanted to keep it. So they nominated maybe 1 or 2 or 3 drugs. And then other groups nominated, 20 or 30, and other groups nominated, maybe 50 or 60. So all in all, from all the different physician groups and pharmacy groups were nominated around 310 total substances. So what happened after they were nominated is something that we'll talk about right after the break. But basically what happened after they were nominated was then a process of hearings was set about. And so then that's where the plot kind of thickens with what's going on right now. But let's take a break. We'll be right back with Medicine and Health with Dr. Paul Anderson, and I will see you soon.
Are you a healthcare provider? Do you know that Dr. Anderson has an online healthcare education website? ConsultDra.com is the continuing education, mentoring, and one-stop shop to find out where Dr. Anderson is speaking, what new online courses are available, and many other services. For subscribers, ConsultDrAnderson.com has a searchable Q&A library, recorded webinars on integrative medicine topics, and many more. Healthcare providers, check out the website at www.consultdranderson.com. That's www.consultdranderson.com.
Welcome back to Medicine and Health with Dr. Paul Anderson. That's me. I'm Dr. Paul. And today, if you missed the first little bit there, we're talking about the Food and Drug Administration's activity around compounding pharmacies. And I explained that compounding pharmacy is a FDA-registered pharmacy that does specific things or unique things. So they might take 2 or 3 drugs that you would take normally separately, put them all into one pill, for example. That'd be a compounding act. They might take a drug and a natural product and put it together in something, right? Then we talked about how there's 2 kinds. There's non-sterile for, say, pills and creams and stuff like that. And there's sterile compounding for eye products, a lot of respiratory products, and then injectables. So then the story went that there was some bad actors in the world of compounding, and it had nothing to do with natural products, really. It had to do with, they were compounding drugs that were being used appropriately by pain management doctors, anesthesia doctors, etc. But what they didn't know was, the doctors didn't know, was that the pharmacy was taking shortcuts, and so people got sick, and some people actually died from some infections. So that triggered a lot of investigation into the pharmacies, and pharmacies, the number of compounding pharmacies around now versus back then have dwindled quite a bit. And they are under very, very close scrutiny, and that's really solved the safety issue, because the problem was there wasn't a lot of close scrutiny in the past. And so if you got somebody who wasn't doing their own quality control and maybe was taking shortcuts for whatever reason, you get these things that happen. So that was a good thing for the safety of everybody. But then the next thing that happened was FDA basically looked and said, well, there's a lot of stuff being compounded that was never really a fully approved drug. Maybe it was so old that it didn't need to be. It was quote unquote grandfathered in, or a lot of stuff was off-label, which is again done every day in medicine, off-label use. So many things were going on, but then FDA said, well, there should be some process to approve these substances called bulk substances. So then the bulk drug substances for pharmacy compounding under Section 503A of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was started. And 503A is the usually smaller, more patient-specific type of pharmacy compounding. And that's what we're talking about today. So then they asked physician groups, pharmacy groups, open, to people who are stakeholders, to come and nominate. So where we left off was about 310 or so substances were nominated. And the idea was, and people thought, okay, well, we'll nominate these things. And let's say, for example, you have a drug such as domperidone, which is used in gastroenterology, digestive troubles, and it's been around forever, and it predated all of the approval process for the most part. So it was made, and it was made for a very specific purpose in digestive medicine or gastroenterology. And so the gastroenterologists nominated that because they use it, or used it a lot. And then the idea would be then that drug or that bulk substance would get a hearing, and then that hearing would go through, why do we use it, and what's the safety, and all this business. So, it all sounded pretty good. So everybody put their nominations in. There were, over 300 nominations. Well, the first thing that happened that I think shocked a lot of people was that about of the 300 and some substances, let's call it 310 plus or minus, about 200 and some, so about 2/3, were immediately put on something called Category 3. And Category 3 means that they don't get a hearing. And so what we started thinking, we're going to nominate, a few hundred substances that are modern things that might be used in compounds, very, innocently put them forward. And about a third of them were taken and said, no, you can't even have a hearing about this. What that means is that when this act gets enacted, so this is an ongoing process, and the FDA doesn't really need to enact it as a law or rules until the process is done. And the process is getting more near done than it ever was. Once it's enacted, if you're a compounding pharmacy, you can't touch any of these substances. Now, people have asked, I'm not going to read all 255 to you because that would just be terribly excessive and everyone would stop viewing. But just some examples of things that would be literally illegal if I am a compounding pharmacy or I'm compounding as a physician for me to possess. Okay? So one would be something like Lactobacillus acidophilus. You've heard of that as a probiotic probably. Now, this is a good one to bring up a super important point before you completely go off the rails hearing this information. The pharmacy world is under FDA and the dietary supplement world is under FDA, but it's two different, think of it as two different food chains, okay? Dietary supplement companies are not affected by this because they're not pharmacies. This is specifically about pharmacy. So you might say, well, so no big deal. I could still go to GNC and get acidophilus then. Sure, you can actually. And we actually have brought that point up at FDA. And they're not terribly worried about that because that's a different food chain. They're worried about the pharmacies. But here's the thing. Let's say this is enacted and this list goes through, then everything on this list of 200 and some, like I said, the third of what was nominated, everything on the list then, I could not, as a physician, have this compounded for a patient. So let's say I had somebody and all the acidophilus product, that was over the counter from supplement companies, either had something in it or didn't have something in it, and I wanted acidophilus and something else put together. I can send that to a pharmacy now and they'll make it for anybody, okay? As soon as this is enacted, my pharmacy can't touch it because it would be illegal to compound. So something that's pretty innocuous doesn't even get a hearing, number one, so it's automatically going to be disallowed. And number two, a pharmacy and a pharmacist who has the highest level of training for making things, such as drugs, would not be able to possess something and manipulate it as a compound that you could go to the drugstore and buy as a supplement or GNC or someplace like that. So other things that are, because people have wondered, and I'll put a link to the list so that you can see them, and there's links on the FDA as well. You just don't want to get confused between 503A like alpha and 503B like beta. They're two different processes. So other things on there, in addition to stuff like acidophilus, alfalfa as an herb is used a lot in certain types of cases, just wasting and other things of that nature. Aldosterone, which is partly a drug, but also it's a hormone. It's used in endocrine medicine. That would not be okay to compound. There are some a lot of herbal things, anise seed and a whole bunch of other, asparagus is on here. So if your pharmacist was, possessing asparagus, they'd be illegal to compound with it. Which, it's funny, but it's also kind of scary and sad. There are forms of folate, which is one of the B vitamins. There's forms of calcium that would be not allowed. There are forms of magnesium that would not be allowed. There are forms of I don't even know who nominated this, but organic vegetables. So your farm, and I think they put it in because sometimes there's things that are used either as a binder or excipient, and sometimes they will use an organic high fiber vegetable or something, or a residue from that to be a binder, I think. So they put that on there. Also of sort of comical, but again, not too comical interest, things like powdered milk, which is used as an excipient in some pills, would be illegal for your pharmacy to have. Just kind of, inane things. So other things like sesame seed, and we actually use sesame seed oil in oncology for people with low platelets. So it has a legitimate purpose. There's a number of minerals here. As I said, a whole lot of herbal things. There's a number of digestive support things. And then there's, a number of forms. So minerals have different forms, a number of forms of copper and magnesium and zinc that then your pharmacist just wouldn't be able to manipulate or use in a compound. So that means if you're getting something that is compounded and it's on that list, as soon as this is enacted, you're not going to be able to use it because the pharmacy would then be jeopardizing their pharmacy license. So what about the 1/3 of things or less that were given a hearing? Well, there are 4 things in something called Category 2. Category 2 is immediately illegal to compound. So the way the FDA looked at it was, if we have a hearing on something and something seems dangerous to us, we're put on Category 2, and a pharmacy has to cease and desist making it. That's what they, so that's Category 2. There's only 4 things on there, but some of them caused a lot of waves. So one is domperidone, which I mentioned earlier, which is used as a motility agent by the gastrointestinal doctors, the digestive system doctors. And there are other motility agents, but this is one that's been around for decades and decades and has been used, and every drug has a downside and has some safety issues, but it's been used for so long, the gastroenterology doctors know very well how to use it. So they immediately lost that particular drug. They appealed that and were told, no, it's not going to be approved. And furthermore, we're going to take it off the market. Another one was quinacrine hydrochloride, which is used in certain types of autoimmune disease for particular effects of autoimmune disease. And again, the doctors who treat patients with advanced autoimmunity had used this for decades and really couldn't understand why it would be taken away. And they've used it longer than most of the other drugs, and there really isn't a great substitute for it. And again, it was just put onto Category 2. There's something that we used a lot in cancer research and is used a lot in Asia. It's still used in Canada and most other places in the world, called germanium sesquioxide. So there's 2 kinds of germanium. One is not used in humans. It's used in the semiconductor industry. And then there's germanium sesquioxide, which is an organic germanium that is used in the stimulation of certain immune cells, which is why it gets used a lot in cancer and chronic infections. So that one was taken and immediately put on the no compounding list. And then a particular drug that's used in other countries that has some, it's like every other drug in the world. It has safety issues if used inappropriately. And this is one that I testified about a couple of years ago, and it was put immediately on to the number 2, automatic not legal list, and that's called cesium chloride. Now, cesium chloride, because I testified about it, is one of those things that, like any other drug, if you know how to use it, how to properly give it, how to monitor the patient, it's no more dangerous than every other drug used in, say, cancer or something like that. And that was the case that we tried to make through the testimony that was given. But because there are some cases where people got very ill who were not taking it under the auspices or monitoring of a doctor, they were going out, buying it on the internet, and giving it to themselves or some family member without a doctor's supervision or dose supervision or anything. The FDA's final verdict was, well, it appears to be dangerous, so we should make it illegal right away. So they did, and it was still being used in a number of places. Now, you can kind of see two sides to the story here that's developing. One is every drug you could make a case that it could be dangerous. Every single drug. You give too much of anything and you can have a problem. Now, one of the reasons you're supposed to have a healthcare practitioner help you with drugs is they are supposed to know how to use the drug, and they're supposed to know how to dose it and how to help you monitor and all of those other things. So in no cases where a healthcare provider, a licensed healthcare provider, was administering and monitoring cesium, was there any danger to the patient. It was all when they bought it off the internet or giving it to, as I said, themselves or somebody else. And so the problem then came that was the decision by which FDA said, well, okay, then we don't want this. Now, they have a number of criteria by which they can either, keep a drug or let it go through to the next step or take it off. One is there a safety issue? One is there historical use, that sort of thing. But another one, which is very vague, is there any other drug in medicine that treats the same condition? And when we got to the end of some of the drugs for cancer, what they basically said was, well, we already have cancer drugs, so we don't need these other things for cancer, which is kind of an interesting thing. So that goes on, great, and things progress. So that's category 2. Those are the 4 that are illegal. Now, what about the bulk of the rest of them? Well, of the over 300 substances to date, there are 16 that were approved, and there's about 18 or so that are left to have a hearing. So you can see that there's, out of 300, we've got 16, right? And that's kind of sad, really, because the bulk of them, the first 2/3, were put on a list that didn't even get a hearing, right? And most of those things on that list are pretty innocuous things. Many of them are minerals. There are some amino acids. These are all things that are in your body already anyway. And then there's some herbal things and some other natural things. But then there's a few drug products in there as well. So when we get down to the world of, well, what did get approved so far, things that got approved, which were great, because then your pharmacy can do it. Now, because you might have just joined, I want to make this really clear that none of this has any effect on a dietary supplement. So, for example, if you go to GNC or you go to Vitamin World or wherever, and you pick up a bottle of acidophilus, that this will not affect that bottle of acidophilus, because that's part of the Dietary Supplement Act, and that's a different world of regulation. But oddly, and not terribly logically in my economy, if I am a pharmacist or a physician and I take that same bulk product, say acidophilus, and I do anything to it other than hand it to you in a pill that a supplement company made, let's say I want to take it and I want to put it together with other products into one thing, then I am now breaking the law because I'm compounding with something that is on a no list. That's how it is. That's how it's going to be. So on the yes list, alpha-lipoic acid for oral use. Now we're trying to get it reheard for injectable use because we use it a lot that way, but that was a good one. Coenzyme Q10, that could be compound, that's a good one. Creatine monohydrate, that's used a lot in people with certain wasting problems and muscle problems and stuff like that. So that's really nice. One that I testified on is a DMPS, which is a drug for toxicity with things like arsenic and mercury and things of that nature that are kind of important to have an antidote for. So it's an antidote drug. There's a lot of topical drugs on here, like tea tree oil and certain types of iodine and stuff like that. So a lot of topicals. Pyridoxal 5-phosphate, which is a type of, it's the active form of vitamin B6, which is really great because there's a type of seizures that are treated with P5P that are not treatable in other manners. So the 16 that so far have a yes, great. You know, I mean, that's good. At least they got on there. The ones that are awaiting hearings of the 18 that we have left, there's a active form of DHEA, 7-keto-DHEA, you've probably heard about, acetyl glucosamine, which is used for a number of things. Tetrathiomolybdenate. Now, you may not have heard this, but it is a drug that is used in cancer therapy, and it's used to deplete the body of some of its copper so that the tumor can't grow new blood vessels and other things. It's part of a bunch of research right now, which means that through the research pathway, it might get approved. But right now, if this were all enacted tomorrow, all doctors using it would be unable to get it. It would literally be illegal to compound. And we use this with our cancer patients. There's major universities using it, lots of things. Some other things for cancer are awaiting hearings, beta-glucans, bromelain, which is commonly used for inflammation, a number of other things, capsaicin, choline, and oddly, you know, we'll see how this goes, but you know, choline is part of your body. It's a major amino acid. EGCG, so that's the one of the extracts from green tea that's used a lot medically. One type of iron, glutathione, which is a major antioxidant in your body, and this is used a lot as a respiratory, like a nasal spray or a nebulizer. It's used topically. It's used as an injection. It's used a lot. Citrulline, again, an amino-like preparation that's used in your body. Methylcobalamin, which is a methylated or active form of the vitamin B12. That's kind of an important one to have, we believe. Phosphatidylserine, this is a fat that's used for a lot of neurological and healing things. It's part of every cell membrane in your body. Pregnenolone, which is a high-order steroid hormone. It's a relative of progesterone. And then resveratrol, you've probably heard about. That's sort of the part of the red wine paradox, and it has a lot of antioxidants. So those are awaiting hearings. But if you're doing the math, we got 18 awaiting hearings, we got 16 that are approved, and we had, you know, roughly a third, you know, so there's 4 on the other list. So who got a no vote? And this is the part that probably will blow your mind. Keeping in mind, it doesn't affect your supplement store, but it affects licensed pharmacists. So if I'm a pharmacist, I cannot have these things and put them together in a pill or a cream or whatever. So there's a couple of amino or amino-like acids that are used daily. Some are used actually in hospitals for healing and other things. So acetylcarnitine and alanyl glutamine. So these are amino products that are used in healing and energy transfer and stuff like that. Aloe vera, that's a pretty commonly used herbal product. But again, if you have your pharmacist make it, once this is enacted, pharmacists couldn't touch it because it would be literally illegal for them to use for compounding. Boswellia. Boswellia is an herb that we use a lot. We use it a lot in cancer. We use it a lot in inflammatory joint problems, things of that nature. Chondroitin sulfate for topical use. Probably heard of chondroitin in some joint products used topically as well. Those are all no's. Chrycine, that's something that's used a lot in hormonal manipulation, especially testosterone imbalances and things. Curcumin. So many peer-reviewed studies in the literature showing that curcumin is useful. One of the only ways to get it for non-standard, so non-pill use, is to have it compounded. But it's now not going to be available to your compounding pharmacy. You can still buy it at the vitamin store. D-ribose, which we use a lot with chronic fatigue folks. Dichloroacetate. Dichloroacetate is something that I've used in cancer research, and we've used it in the past when it was available quite a bit with people with metabolic cancer therapies. There's something called DIM, or diindolylmethionine, which is used in the hormonal cancers and hormone imbalances. Glycyrrhizin, that is a part of the licorice root, so it's not the whole licorice root, but glycyrrhizin or glycyrrhizic acid is something that is researched in hepatitis C and B, HIV. It's very protective to the liver. It has a whole lot of properties, and it has a whole lot of research around it, but that would become illegal to compound. MSM, methylsulfonomethane, you can go buy it, anywhere in a powdered form, but let's say you have a doctor who wants to use it in an injection or inhaled or something, you won't be able to make that. Nettle is a common herb that's used, but it's interesting, nettle they would say it would be an illegal compound. NAD and NADH. Now, there's a lot of clinics you may have heard of that use NAD therapy for addiction and fatigue and all sorts of other stuff, and neither NAD or its cousin NADH were approved, so they were disapproved. There's a couple of other things that are important in very small parts of medicine, but probably not worth talking about too much. Quercetin is in many plants as a bioflavonoid, so there's that. All on the no list. Mild silver protein, which is used in a lot of things for topical use, especially for infections and all of that. Ubiquinol, now I said CoQ10 was approved. Ubiquinol is a relative of CoQ10, and it would not be approved. Vanadyl sulfate, and then some others that are on there. So essentially, as we get down to the end of our time here, kind of need to wrap up. But as I said, this is a process that I've been involved with since at least 2014, maybe earlier, in providing scientific data, providing background data, providing testimony at the FDA, et cetera. And it's getting to the end. We're down to 18 products that need to have hearings. As I said, a third of the 300 roughly, two-thirds didn't even get a hearing. They're just going to become illegal to compound. So the technical points to take home are that not many things are going to be approved. Number two, this affects pharmacies, especially compounding pharmacies only. And so if your compounding pharmacy is currently making something for you that, say, has MSM in it, or has acidophilus or something like that, the pharmacy can't have it, and they can't compound with it anymore. And number three, the process, which we could go into, but we don't have time today, is, in my opinion, from being there and watching it, being a part of it, it's really a stacked deck. And so the comeback from the FDA when we testify as well, if you want one of these other products, so let's say acidophilus, just to pick one out of the air, but if you want one of these products to be legal to compound, you need to go through the standard investigational new drug process. called the IND process, which is fine. That's there for a reason. It's there to test things out and do all that stuff. The problem is that running a drug or a substance of any kind through an IND process is tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars at the minimum. And nobody is going to put that kind of money into almost any of these products because they're not patentable. Many of them are natural and not patentable. Many of them are synthetic and not patentable. So no one's really going to be able to ever sell them for a whole lot of money. And in many cases, they have very specific use, such as certain types of cancer or certain types of arthritis or certain whatever. So the market is not big enough for a big company. So let's say, Bayer Pharmaceuticals wanted to take it on. If they look at it and it's not going to sell, a fairly large amount, they're not going to go through spend the money. That would be a bad business decision. So in effect, what FDA is doing through this is curtailing your and my right to have very traditionally safe products that are compounded by a licensed pharmacy that is licensed to do compounding and who have all the training and materials to do it. Far higher scrutiny than most, say, supplement companies or something like that. So this would remove from them, make illegal for them to use these things, many of which have been used traditionally very safely for years. And like I said, in the one experience with the one medication we use sometimes in cancer, the only bad events that they could point to were all when somebody went online and bought it and were not using, the help of a healthcare practitioner to do it right. So of course, if you went online and you bought, a bunch of penicillin or you bought a bunch of digitalis or something like that, you took it wrong, you're going to get sick. That's why we have healthcare providers, but the FDA is not seeing it that way. So you can get this information. I have the lists and some question and answer and all of that. I'll put into the show notes. We'll get this up on the podcast or the website. You can go on consult Dr. Anderson, so CONSULT Anderson, just my name, consultdranderson.com. In the search box, put in FDA and 503, and you can get this document right away that has all of the lists and links and all that business if you want to, or you can wait till it comes out. So I'm Dr. Paul Anderson. We're running out of time here, and this has been very heavy on my mind because this process has gone on a long time. The process will be coming to a close as soon as we have hearings on the rest of these. We don't know when the next hearings are, but they'll be, sooner than later. And it will certainly curtail your ability to get compounded medications. So please consider looking into this in the links in the document. You can, there's a place you can donate to our legal fund. There's a place you can make comment to the FDA. It's all FDA links. You can get that. And you can also read the actual lists and what's going on from the FDA. But I'm out of time now, so I'm Dr. Paul, and I'm coming to you for Medicine Health with Dr. Paul Anderson, and I really appreciate you listening today. I know this is a heavy topic, but it's a very necessary one to get out into the world. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Medicine and Health with your host, Dr. Paul Anderson. Visit the clinic website at www.amsa1.com or call the clinic at 206-629-2186.